everybody and welcome to Quick Code Wednesday. Today we are going to build a custom React hook that will easily allow us to make HTTP requests in our React applications. So let's get started. Alright, I'm inside a React project and I've already created a hooks folder inside the SRC folder. Now we need to create our hook. Let's call it use HTTP request. And it will accept two parameters. First is going to be a URL, which will be an empty string, and a options object, which will be null. Okay. So we are going to need three pieces of state. One to store the data that comes from the API, and by default is going to be null. One piece of state to store the error that comes from the API. Also, it will be null. And one piece of state for a better user experience to let the user know that the request is loading. We are going to call it loading and set loading, and by default is going to be false. Of course, in order to work, we need to import use state from React. And also because fetching data is a side effect, we will need to import the use effect hook. Awesome. So in our use effect hook, the first thing that we can do is to set the loading to true, and we will use the fetch API which will return us a promise, and we are passing to the fetch API the URL and the options. Also we can pass these two variables in the dependency array. Okay, so once the promise is resolved with the fetch API, we need to do this syntax, and then in the second then we have the data. And here we can set our data piece of state to the data that comes from the API. And also let's set the error to null. Cool. Now to catch some errors, we need to set the error to the error piece of state. Let's set the data to null here. And finally, we can set the loading back to false. And from this hook, we are going to return an object with the data, with the error, and with the loading. Okay, so far so good. One more thing that we can do to improve this hook and to prevent memory leaks in our application is to use a boolean inside the use effect, and let's call it isMounted and set it to true. And here in the then block, we can make a check. So if the component is mounted, only then set the data and the error. Also in the catch block we can do the same thing. If is mounted. Awesome. And on the finally we can do it with this syntax, is mounted, and set the loading to false. Also we need to clean up this use effect with a return, and here we are going to set the isMounted to false. One more thing that we need to do is to export this hook, use HTTP request. Cool. Now let's say that in app.js component we need to render a list of users, or I call them authors, it doesn't matter. First thing that we need to do is to import the use HTTP request hook, and here I've used a placeholder API that we can call. So in our component, I've destructured from the use HTTP request hook the loading, the error, and the data, and I've passed it the URL constant. So let's say that if the request is loading, we can make some checks here. So if the request is loading, we can return this string, or if we have an error, we can return this string. Of course, you can import here any other component, for example, and you can create a nice component here that will look much better than this string. And if we have data, we map through the data and we render the list of authors. Okay, let's have a look in the browser to see how all the pieces fit together. So we have here a list of authors, and if I refresh, we can see that we are making a request to this URL. And let's say that we have a slow connection. we will see that loading authors list message because the request is still loading. Anytime now, you see, and now we have the authors. Alright, to end this episode, first of all, I hope you enjoyed it, and just as a homework, if you want to do it, you can improve it by using, for example, Axios, or by adding TypeScript support, or by being creative and adding your own touch to make it even better, to improve the user experience or the performance. I'll see you in the next one.